Ethan Hayes thought he had married the perfect woman. Lillian, devoted to her faith and adored by their small-town community, seemed to live a life of grace and honesty. But when Ethan followed her to a church program in a nearby town, he uncovered a devastating secret. His wife had another man, 2 children, and an entire second life he knew nothing about. What began as heartbreak quickly spiraled into obsession, and by the time the truth came fully to light, it was already too late to stop the bloodshed. Ethan Hayes lived a life of routine and devotion. In the small rural town of Willow Creek, he was known as a dependable man, a quiet, respectful figure who worked hard during the week and never missed Sunday service. He built houses for a living, and he took pride in his work. But the cornerstone of his life wasn't his job. It was his wife, Lillian. To Ethan, she was the kind of woman men prayed for. Graceful, soft-spoken, and deeply involved in church life. She was loved by everyone in the community. They had been married for 7 years, and although they had no children, they built a stable life together. Their days were predictable in the best way: early morning coffee, evening walks, Sunday dinners. Their home, a modest 2-bedroom house on a quiet street, was filled with signs of their shared life. Wedding photos lined the hallway, inspirational verses decorated the walls, and Ethan's toolbox sat neatly by the back door. Nothing seemed out of place. Lillian had always been involved in their local church. She ran the children's Bible study, helped with meal programs, and volunteered to organize regional events. Ethan admired her dedication and never once questioned her late-night planning meetings or weekend trips to nearby towns for church outreach. If anything, he felt proud. He believed Lillian was doing God's work, and he supported her without hesitation. He worked extra hours so she didn't have to take on a second job, and often told people that he was lucky to be married to such a strong, kind woman. Though deeply in love, Ethan wasn't blind. There were moments over the years that gave him pause, times when Lillian seemed distracted or hesitant to talk about where she'd been. Once or twice he had noticed unfamiliar names on her phone, but she always brushed it off as church contacts. He never pressed. He trusted her completely. In his heart, Ethan believed that trust was the foundation of any strong marriage, and Lillian had never given him a clear reason to doubt her. Lillian's involvement in the church grew more intense over time. She often volunteered to travel for planning sessions in neighboring towns. Ethan never once thought these trips were anything more than what she claimed. He would pack her snacks, remind her to call when she arrived, and kiss her goodbye at the door like always. When she returned, she always brought back photos of events, stories of fellowship, and handmade cards from children. Her phone would buzz from time to time, but she usually ignored it when Ethan was around. He chalked it up to ministry responsibilities and the pressure of planning large programs. The two were well known and respected in their town. Older couples looked at them as an example of faith-based love. Younger couples sought advice on building strong relationships. Their reputation was spotless. People often said that if you wanted to see a godly marriage in action, look at Ethan and Lillian Hayes. Ethan felt blessed. He believed his marriage was a partnership built on truth, patience, and shared faith. But he had no idea that behind Lillian's warm smile and gentle prayers, she was carrying a secret, one so large, so carefully hidden, it would eventually tear their world apart. What Ethan didn't know was that the life he thought was perfect was actually divided between 2 towns, 2 families, and 2 truths. One day, a simple church event would bring everything to the surface, and nothing would ever be the same again. The announcement came during a routine Sunday service. The pastor stood at the pulpit, speaking warmly about unity and growth, and invited the congregation to a regional church program being held in a nearby town the following weekend. Several churches would gather for a day of worship, fellowship, and community service. Lillian, as one of the most active members, was asked to attend and represent their congregation in a volunteer capacity. She accepted the invitation without hesitation, nodding politely as others offered words of encouragement. Ethan was proud of her. He had always admired her dedication to their faith community and saw this as another opportunity for her to shine. She told him she would be away for most of the weekend, as she needed to help with preparations the day before the event. Ethan didn't question it. He gave her a hug, helped her pack a small overnight bag, and even slipped a note inside with a prayer for her safety. As she drove off Saturday morning, he stood on the porch, watching her car disappear down the road, unaware that she wasn't just headed to a church program. The idea to surprise her came later that afternoon. Ethan had finished his chores early, and something stirred in him. A simple, sweet thought. He hadn't been to one of Lillian's events in a while, and he imagined how happy she'd be to see him walk through the doors. He would bring her favorite iced tea, sit quietly in the back pew, and wait until her session ended. The image made him smile, and without much thought he grabbed his keys and started the hour-long drive to the neighboring town. The church hosting the event was larger than the one they attended back home. The parking lot was nearly full, and people gathered in small groups outside, laughing and greeting one another. Ethan made his way in quietly, not wanting to disturb anything. The service was already in progress, the soft sound of music filling the air. He scanned the stage for Lillian but didn't see her. Confused, he stepped further inside, eyes searching the crowd. And then he saw her. She was seated near the side of the sanctuary, away from the main group, her posture relaxed. What caught Ethan's attention wasn't just her presence, but who she was sitting with. A man, casually dressed, leaned close to her as if they were mid-conversation. Beside them were two children, both nestled close to Lillian, as if they had known her their whole lives. Ethan watched in disbelief as Lillian brushed the little girl's hair away from her face and handed the boy something from her purse. She smiled, laughed, even leaned her head gently on the man's shoulder. It wasn't the kind of gesture shared between strangers or church members. It was something far more intimate. Ethan's hands grew cold, his thoughts frozen. He remained hidden in the shadows at the back of the room, heart thudding painfully in his chest. Lillian's movements were fluid, natural, unguarded. She didn't look like someone playing a role. She looked like someone who belonged. The service continued around him, but Ethan no longer heard a word. His eyes were locked on the woman he thought he knew, the wife he had trusted completely. The moment stretched endlessly, twisting into something sharp and unreal. He left before the final hymn began, slipping quietly out the door and walking to his truck in silence. As he sat behind the wheel, he felt as though he had stepped into a nightmare. The life he believed was built on faith and honesty now felt like a cruel illusion. Nothing made sense, but one thing was certain. What he saw that day would not be forgotten. Something had broken inside him, and he knew he would never see Lillian the same way again. Ethan drove home that night in silence, his mind looping through the images he had just witnessed. Every mile felt heavier than the last, as though he were driving further into a world he no longer recognized. When he arrived back in Willow Creek, the house looked the same as it always had. Quiet, warm, familiar, but everything inside him had changed. He sat in his truck for a long time, staring at the porch light that Lillian had left on, a habit she never missed. It used to make him feel loved. Now, it felt staged. The next day, Lillian returned with her usual cheerful tone. She told Ethan the program had been a success, that she was tired from all the planning and activities. He nodded and pretended to listen, but inside, he was detached, numb. He didn't ask questions. He didn't mention that he had been there. He simply watched her, memorizing every detail of her face, wondering how long she had been living this double life. That night, while she slept, he picked up her phone for the first time in their marriage without her knowing. What he found was more than just confirmation, it was proof. Photos of the children in parks, birthday cakes with candles, handwritten cards calling her mom. Ethan's hands trembled as he swiped through images of the man he had seen at the church program, smiling with Lillian and the kids, standing outside a house in a nearby town that looked lived in, warm like home. There were text messages, too, dozens of them, conversations filled with affection, plans, and years of secrets. Lillian hadn't just visited this family, she had built a life with them. Ethan scrolled further back, discovering the relationship had started before their wedding. She had never left Marcus, the other man. She had simply added Ethan to her carefully balanced world. She had created two realities, moving between them with precision and grace, using the church as her shield. Her schedule, her errands, her overnight trips, they had all been part of a lie so seamless, so deeply embedded, that Ethan had never once questioned her loyalty. The betrayal cut deeper than Ethan could have imagined. He wasn't just angry, he was humiliated. Every Sunday school lesson she had taught, every prayer they had shared felt tainted. The community that looked up to them, the friends who saw them as the example of a perfect couple, it was all built on a false foundation. Lillian had never truly been his. She had simply worn the part. Ethan stopped going to church. He called in sick to work. He barely spoke. Days passed in a haze. Each time he looked at her, he saw the two children who would never call him dad, the man who had stolen the life Ethan believed he had. He imagined the moments she shared with them while pretending to be his wife. The lies began to echo louder than the truth ever had. He couldn't escape the thoughts. They followed him into his sleep, haunted his meals, crept into the quietest parts of his day. Ethan had spent years building a life with a woman who had already given herself to someone else. And now, all he could think about was what came next. Because there was no going back. The truth was out, and the man he once was had begun to vanish under the weight of betrayal. Something darker was taking root, something irreversible. Ethan's world continued to unravel as the days dragged by in silence. Each morning, he woke up beside Lillian and stared at the ceiling, his chest heavy with a mixture of pain, confusion, and growing anger. She went about her routines as if nothing had changed, smiling gently, offering him coffee, humming quietly while folding laundry. To her, the lie remained intact. To him, every move she made felt like a cruel performance. He said little, barely responding to her attempts at normal conversation. His trust had been shattered, but what hurt more was the calmness in her face. The ease with which she lived two lives. He didn't confront her. Instead, he let the silence speak. He needed more time, more answers. His pain wasn't just about betrayal. It was about meaning. What did the last 7 years mean? Was he just a safety net? A second home? He wondered if she had ever loved him at all, or if he was just a part of her cover. The more he dwelled on it, the more he began to feel erased, like his existence had been borrowed, used, and discarded. Late at night, he started driving. At first, he told himself it was just to clear his head. But the truth was, he couldn't sleep. He couldn't sit still in the house they had shared. He drove past the church, past the homes of neighbors who waved at him every week. But more often, his car ended up in the neighboring town, parked down the street from Marcus Ya's house, the place he had only seen in photos and from a distance during the church program. He never got out. He just sat in the car and stared. The porch light was usually on, toys scattered across the yard. One night he saw Lillian through the window, sitting on the couch with the children nestled beside her. She looked peaceful, maternal, safe. The man, Marcus, entered the room a moment later and kissed her gently on the forehead. Ethan had never felt so invisible. Those nights changed something inside him. The pain hardened. The betrayal turned sharp. He stopped wondering why it had happened and started thinking about how he had let it happen. In his mind, Lillian had taken everything from him. His pride, his love, his future, and the man she had chosen instead lived a life Ethan could only dream of. It was no longer just about heartbreak. It was about justice, twisted by grief and rage. Ethan began preparing in secret. He moved slowly, methodically. He deleted messages, cleared his browser history, and started distancing himself from everyone he knew. He told his employer he was dealing with a family emergency and might need time away. No one asked questions. Everyone assumed it was stress. And it was. Just not the kind anyone could have imagined. One evening, Ethan drove 2 towns over and walked into a small hardware store. He didn't hesitate. He picked up a hunting knife, paid in cash, and left. He drove back in silence, not touching the radio, not even checking his phone. When he got home, he placed the knife in the garage, hidden under a pile of old clothes in a sealed toolbox. He sat on the edge of the bed that night and stared at Lillian as she slept, completely unaware of what was coming. He felt numb, but focused. The decision was no longer brewing. It had solidified. Ethan wasn't just a heartbroken husband anymore. In his mind, he had become the victim of a deep betrayal, and he was ready to do something about it. There was no fear left, only purpose. What had started as love, then turned to grief, had now become something far more dangerous. It happened just before dawn on a Monday morning. The streets were still and quiet, the town wrapped in early light, not yet awake to what would soon unfold. Ethan had waited for the right moment, and now, in his mind, it had arrived. He drove the familiar road to the neighboring town once again, not to watch or hesitate, but to act. The hunting knife sat on the passenger seat wrapped in a cloth, a silent promise of what he believed had to be done. His hands were steady. The rage that had once burned hot had cooled into something far more dangerous, calculated, cold, and irreversible. He parked 3 blocks from Marcus's house and walked the rest of the way. Every step felt deliberate. The early morning fog clung to the air, muffling the sound of his boots against the sidewalk. The house stood in the distance, lights off, curtains drawn. To anyone else, it looked like the home of a quiet, loving family. But to Ethan, it was a stage built on lies where he had been cast as the fool. He entered through the back door, which had been left slightly ajar, a careless habit he had observed during his many late-night stakeouts. Inside, the house was silent, save for the quiet ticking of a wall clock. Ethan moved through the rooms like a shadow, guided by anger and betrayal. He found Marcus first, asleep in the master bedroom. The attack was swift and brutal. There was no struggle, only a flash of motion, the sound of breath catching, and then silence. Ethan stood over the man who had unknowingly shared his wife, the knife dripping in his hand, his mind already detached from what he had done. He turned toward the hallway, his footsteps slow, his breathing heavy. Lillian's voice broke the silence, confused and alarmed by the noise. She emerged from a side room, her expression shifting from fear to recognition in an instant. There was no time for explanations, no room for words. What followed was chaos, shouts, a fall, the knife in motion once again. Unlike Marcus, Lillian fought back. She screamed, waking the children who huddled behind a locked door as the nightmare unfolded outside. When it was over, Ethan stood alone in the living room, covered in blood, surrounded by broken fragments of a secret life. The children's cries echoed down the hall. The sound seemed distant to him, like a memory he couldn't reach. He left the same way he came, disappearing into the breaking morning, not stopping until he reached a quiet rest area along the highway. He sat in his truck, the weapon beside him, and stared blankly out the windshield until the police arrived. It didn't take long for them to find him. A neighbor had called in the screams. Officers swarmed the house, finding Marcus dead and Lillian critically injured, bleeding but alive. The children were shaken but unharmed. By midday, Ethan was in custody. He confessed to everything without hesitation. No lawyer, no excuses, just a quiet acknowledgement of what he had done. The trial was swift. Ethan's confession left little room for doubt. The community was shocked, split between disbelief and sorrow. The man they had trusted, admired even, had unraveled so completely that no one recognized him anymore. Lillian survived but disappeared from public view. With the help of extended family, she moved away with her children, determined to start again far from the place where everything fell apart. Ethan was sentenced to life in prison. He never appealed, never asked for mercy. To him, his actions had been inevitable, the only response to a life stolen from beneath him. In the end, it wasn't the secret itself that destroyed them. It was the weight of a truth too heavy to bear, exposed in the worst possible way. A husband, a wife, a hidden family, and a moment of violence that left scars no one could ever erase.